Welcome back to The Heat. We've just heard from former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Cohen on a range of major issues that impact the China-U.S. relationship today. Now, for a Chinese perspective, joining us is Wang Guan. He is Chief Political Correspondent for CCTV America's Mandarin service. And also with us is Chen Weihua. He is the Chief Washington Correspondent for China Daily and Deputy Editor of China Daily USA. Welcome, gentlemen, to the show. Weihua, let me start with you. There are differences between the United States and China, especially on the South China Sea issue. But despite those tensions, we heard Secretary Cohen tell us there that he's very optimistic. He described a very upbeat relationship between these two countries. Do you believe that optimism is justified?
Well, I like his optimism. I think there was need more optimist in Sino-U.S. relationship. I mean, ultimately, the two countries have far more common interests. There's a huge potential, for the relationship. If you look at the days, maybe Secretary Cohen was in office, it was a trade between the two countries, a billion, but now approaching 600 billion. It's going to expanding further. Look at the days, maybe there was only 50, 60,000 Chinese students, now 300,000. And you see the Chinese tourists coming in droves. So the potential is huge. So I think there is a ground for optimism. But at the same time, I think the optimism should be built on tackling our problems also, because as Secretary Cohen mentioned, there was the problem of mistrust, strategic distrust, I would say. I would attribute to as a sort of the fast China's rise. There was a lot in the U.S. field unease, not used to this new China. China's economy, the second largest in the world, several times larger than Secretary Cohen was in office. So China is in Africa, China is in Latin America. So a lot of American politicians interpret it as China is challenging the U.S. status, even in, as you said, in Asia Pacific. So what I feel deeply troubled is you have U.S. politicians, U.S. leaders actually, from President Obama, talking quite, I would say, negatively all the time about China should not set the rule. China is, cyber theft, a villain. All these rhetoric. What was the last time you heard President Xi saying things like that? Never, probably. So I think there should be a change of rhetoric, from the top leaders to give American people and people in both countries sort of a positive, good direction.
Right. Guan, when we look at the common challenges that these two countries face, Secretary Cohen mentioned some of them: nuclear proliferation, terrorism, and he pointed out that these two countries have to work together. There is no other way.
Well, I agree. I think it's interesting that my colleague Weihua mentioned rhetoric, because covering D.C. for the past 4 years, going to the press conferences of the White House and the State Department, for me, a biggest challenge is to read the tea leaves, to distinguish the official U.S. position from their real intention. Because on the surface, those American politicians, like Weihua said, sometimes you hear negative comments, but on other occasions, they would say they welcome the peaceful rise of China. What do they really think? What are their military deployments? 70,000 troops in Asia Pacific, and also this cyber confrontation with China. So on the security side, it's a very tense relationship. I think what can offer us a sneak peek, offers us an opportunity to sneak a peek into President Obama's mentality, if you will, on China, was a recent interview he did with The Atlantic. It's a very long interview. It's a 1-hour read, by the way. And in that interview, President Obama pointed out China as the biggest potential rival to the United States. He said not Russia, because given its population, its economic structure, China would be America's future competitor. And it's very interesting to see, the contrast between the official positions from the podium and contrasting that with the real intentions, which is few and far between, hard to get for journalists like us.
But Weihua, on some issues, they will have to cooperate. One of those issues being the nuclear issue in the DPRK. The United States, as we heard Secretary Cohen tell us, will look to China taking the lead in resolving that issue. As Secretary Cohen put it, China is in a better position than anyone to get the DPRK's attention. How does China see that?
I think, he is right to the extent that, we are a neighbor with North Korea,
Right.
the DPRK. So, I mean, we have more trade, more contacts with DPRK than any other countries, probably. But that said, I would want to point out that China is supporting the UN resolution and is opposing the DPRK to be not recognizing DPRK as a nuclear state. So that's the firm stand of the Chinese government. But at the same time, I think the U.S. has been pushing too much on the sanction side because almost like the U.S. believes that the sanction will solve the problem. It won't. I mean, as it has been proven repeatedly in the past years. I mean, you don't solve the nuclear issue in DPRK with more sanction. Instead, actually...
In fact, we did hear from another Chinese analyst who told us that China and the United States differ on the approach to the DPRK. China wants policy change. The U.S. wants regime change.
Exactly, because I think the real concern, that's why China have put forward this so-called parallel approach, which is for the DPRK to abandon the nuclear program, but at the same time, for the U.S. to agree to replace the 1953 armistice agreement with a peace treaty, because North Korea, DPRK, I would say, really worried about its own security. I mean, it's announced its nuclear weapon as a sort of protection of its own government, because it's thought, I think DPRK believed for the U.S., I mean, regime change is genetic. I mean, it's in the U.S. genes, so you cannot change it. I mean, the good example is Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, who gave up the nuclear weapons, and with the U.S. promise not going for regime change, of course, the U.S. broke the promise. And so I think the U.S. should also, while pushing for sanctions, should think, sanctions will not lead to a solution, and should try other means as well.
Guan, what do you make of the fact that the Secretary said that in the region, Southeast Asia, East Asia, there shouldn't be any kind of competition for power there, that no one power should dominate that particular region?
Well, I think this sounds to me to be a softer version of U.S. exceptionalism, in that the U.S. still wants to maintain the security architecture that it helped create to a large extent after the World War II and throughout the Cold War. Of course, it did great things, rebuilding Japan, Germany after the war, and then its military alliance helped commerce to thrive to a large extent. But what's interesting in President Obama's interview with Atlantic that I mentioned was President Obama confided with the reporter that he thinks he himself is pretty much amazed by the Americans' ability to rally those East Asian countries around the U.S., to strengthen the alliances, the military allies, to go against China, to hedge against China at least. And he himself he's saying in that interview that he doesn't think China's leaders would expect that. So you do see that this containment mentality there, hedging against China at least. I think the U.S. is not accustomed to the fact that there is a rising and competing power that in due time might be rising to a level that is on par with itself.
Okay, well, we're rapidly running out of time, but I've got to get this question in. I raised the issue of anti-Chinese rhetoric on the election campaign trail here in the United States. Secretary Cohen felt that this is election rhetoric. Mm-hmm. It's not reality. Do you agree?
Well, yes or no. I think, on the one hand, we know, the campaign rhetoric is almost like a political game. It's not really true. We should not take it serious. But at the same time, because of this, what we mentioned, deep strategic distrust between the two countries, and this is very poisonous to the relationship. I almost want to describe it as sort of a hate speech to the bilateral relationship. If you listen to, Donald Trump and some others, and it's number one, it's false. It's not based on facts, and the other is really misleading people. Most Americans, I would say, don't really have a good grasp of the relationship, So they listen to these politicians. So it's misleading people. And when the Pew Center have their survey, shows low favorability among Americans towards Chinese, I think such nasty negative rhetoric really played a role.
Chen Weihua, Wang Guan, thanks to both of you for joining us.